Hello, so today we're going to be going over the top comps that you can play in patch 13.5. These are going to be some recommendations, especially more geared towards beginner players or people that are starting out in playing TFT right now. I'm going to give you 3 reroll comps as well as 3 non-reroll comps that you can use to hopefully help you have a little bit of an idea based on some of the changes that happened in the most recent patch. Now, before much ado, please make sure to like and subscribe if you like my content. This is my gaming channel where I post daily TFT content, so I do guides, I do VOD reviews, and I also do some other reaction and explorative content as well, so please make sure to like and subscribe. Additionally, my store recently opened. It also links on the YouTube, so if you're interested in any art, I do ukiyo-e style art, and I'm also eventually going to start doing some more wood carvings and post them onto my art store, shop.fenrir's art, which this links to. So thank you for your support, everybody, and of course you don't have to buy anything. I just always advertise the shop because it was a thing I was working on for a while, but of course just liking and subscribing for free is very helpful for me as well. Now, I kind of just put this more for like the bait for if people hover the thumbnail, but we're going to go through 3 non-reroll comps. Now, I recently did the patch 13.5 review on my channel. It happened like 1 or 2 days ago. This patch isn't very big, so a lot of this is going to be a rehash. If you've been already playing TFT, the meta isn't really that different. Maybe you just have to adjust the way that you look at certain comps, but nothing's really changed all that much from last patch to this patch. Maybe there's like 1 or 2 other things that have a very niche line, but if you're looking for your default comps, they're going to be very similar. And that brings us to the number 1 comp that I always recommend, especially if you're a beginner player. Scrap. Scrap is still one of the best comps to play. Scrap is very unconditional. When I say unconditional, it means like you don't have to have like an emblem, you don't have to have a certain augment. It's very flexible. It gives you have a good potential to cap out and play around the scrap units pretty easily. Without needing to have much work ahead of time in order to make it work. With some of the other comps need you to be either really far ahead, they need you to be high rolling, you need to hit particular units, etc. With scrap, you're usually in a really good spot so long as you take 2 things. You want a lot of gold, you want a lot of econ because you're trying to play more of a narrow line and it's a really expensive board typically, so you want a lot of econ, and then you also want a lot of items. Items is how scrap really caps out high. It scales well into the late game because you continue to get items, so you continue to generate more shield for that 6 scrap. 6 scrap is usually what you want to play because your items become lucky. I've talked about scrap a lot, so this might be a little bit fast, especially if you're a beginner and this is your first time seeing the patch, or seeing the game right now, like maybe you just started playing a week ago. Basically with scrap, components will turn lucky. If you put a component on a unit, if you have 6 scrap in, it will turn into a completed item, so it's very powerful. What I show here is these are like the recommended components I like to put on the scrap units. If you think about the scrap units, you usually play these 6 scrap units on your scrap board, and then you find auxiliary units to supplement this on level 8 and level 9. A lot of times you can play around Vi, which gives you Pit Fighter with Gangplank, as well as Elise, which has like a very strong effect of stunning the front of the board, and she synergizes with Bruiser as well as Form Swapper to help cap out your board relatively high. Additionally, you can also play around Alawi if you have a Rumble already to give your board extra Sentinel synergy, because Sentinel applies armor to your entire board when you have the trait active, similar to how Bruiser gives your whole board 100 HP. So some sort of extra little touch of frontline and everything else. Now, when you're looking at the items, when you have the lucky items and you put certain components on units, those lucky components could only turn into 1 item, so it's easier to plan your completed item sets around. So that's why a lot of times if I'm holding extra components for my scrap units, I will try to put a tier on Echo, a tier on Rumble, a belt on Corki, and a belt on Gangplank. So a belt on Corki and Gangplank will always turn into a guard breaker, which is a good item. It has damage amp, it has some crit synergy because it's made with a glove. So a lot of times it's easier to play around. If you know what the component's going to turn into, you don't have to worry about low rolling your items. And this applies to mostly 6 scrap. So with Corki, then I usually build a full crit build. So I'm looking to make an IE and hopefully a Last Whisper to have some sort of utility, Sunder or Shred, right? Sunder and Shred. With Echo and Rumble, a tier will always turn into a Hand of Justice, so it's very easy to play around because you can likewise build yourself around the idea that you have Omnivamp already on these frontline melee units, and then you can build around those, right? So for example with Echo, sometimes even though he's Ambusher, I like to do something like a Jewel Gauntlet just to like maximize the damage, and then some sort of AP item. But a lot of times you end up with something that looks like this. You get Rabadons, your extra Rod items usually find their way on Echo pretty easily, and similarly, these items work really well on Rumble, so a lot of times I'll transfer, this and maybe a tank on Rumble for late game, excuse me. Because you have so much scrap shield, a lot of times you'll see people put Corki in the front line and Powder in the front line. The main reason you're doing this is because with their scrap shield, they're not at risk of dying. Corki himself will also run away. As part of his cast, he kind of flies away to a different area. So if you put him in the front row, he can take a little bit of damage. The scrap shield will still exist, so he won't actually take damage a lot of the time. And then with that, you'll be able to get an earlier cast, because if you get hit by attacks, you generate mana, and that allows the Corki to cast a little bit faster, which can sway the fight, because if you get your Corki to cast faster, you get an extra cast off in the fight. That could be the difference maker in winning. So that's why a lot of times you'll see people put Corki in the front line. But this is a board that most people probably know about. You have inter-team synergy with Ambusher. You can cap out very high with many different options on level 9. You can play deeper into the Ambusher trait. You can play extra frontline synergies. But typically you have enough frontline and you really want to have damage. So you're prioritizing no tank items. You're always prioritizing damage items. Last Whisper and Spark or Sunder and Shred is really important, because eventually you want to try and maximize your damage around those. And eventually, Rumble and Powder do have anti-heal, but it is still good to make anti-heal because it's more consistent a lot of the time. So late game, you'll try and make either a Morello or a red buff to put on a Gangplank. And typically that's how you, just a little crash course on scrap. I'm sure everybody already knows how to play it, but just as a refresher, because this guide has to appeal to everybody. If you already know how to play it, you could have just skipped that part, but it is what it is. Anyways, the number 2 comp that I would like to talk about is Sorcerers. Sorcerer is the other comp. It's like the big AP lean. If you have AP items, a lot of times you're leaning towards Sorc if it's not reroll. Sorcerers are pretty much untouched from last patch to this patch, and it's quite a strong comp that has many different variations, which we'll talk about here. So they recently changed Sorc to be only 6 sorcerers, so now you don't need an emblem in order to hit 9 Sorc. That was happened a couple patches ago, but generally what you're trying to play around is Zoe and LeBlanc. Now both Zoe and LeBlanc, they care a lot about attack speed. A lot of times, because you're going to have so much AP, you care about building attack speed items, damage amp items, and some sort of item that converts that into something, converts that a huge amount of AP into more damage, right? So a lot of times when you're playing around LeBlanc and Zoe, you'll see people make like a Jewel Gauntlet, for example, right? Jewel Gauntlet could take all the AP that you get, because the whole point of Sorcerer is that you gain a bunch of AP. You can take that AP and now turn it into a crit on the ult, which now makes it an absurd amount of damage, basically. A lot of times you'll see also people building Gwinsus, because Gwinsus is pretty good on both Zoe and LeBlanc. But even if you have tiers and you can make general mana items, those are also fine a lot of the time. But typically you'll see building high into either crit or damage amp, just because you can really convert that into a massive amount of burst damage. This comp, as you can see, there's a lot of backline units. There's not that many frontline units. Swain can also even become a backline unit in a lot of cases. So a lot of times you're trying to make a board that is very explosive in its damage. LeBlanc also really likes to have anti-heal, because of the way that she applies her damage to multiple units. You can spread out the anti-heal very well, but LeBlanc is the main key here. A lot of times this comp is hard to play if you don't have LeBlanc to supplement your damage alongside Zoe. LeBlanc is like the main Giga unit a lot of the times. So typically you'll see people put their main damage items on LeBlanc as soon as they hit a LeBlanc, and that's not to say that's like strong, to say the least, right? Attack speed is much better than mana on LeBlanc, because she gets mana locked. That means that she just stops gaining mana in certain points of her cast. So typically people like to put attack speed items on her, so that's where like the Gwinsu comes into play. But then, like I said before, damage amp, crit chance, very flexible with your items, but that's what you're trying to do. Make a rendition of attack speed, and either damage amp or crit chance can help out really greatly with the LeBlanc damage, right? So I'll just put these items here. These aren't BIS by any means, but I think with Sorcs you have many options of items that can work out, which is very nice. Now, when you're playing around Sorcerers, typically you'll also play it with Black Rose. Here I'm going to drop one of the Sorc units, because usually you play around 6 Sorc, and then you're almost always finding an Elise. Elise synergizes with the Swain for frontline. You can often reroll Swain Nami 3 as well, but it's very hard because you're typically not uncontested in playing this line. You get the Form Swapper synergy for your front line around the Swain, and by playing Black Rose with the LeBlanc, you also easily get in a Scion, which can help out your front line tremendously, because now, as you can see, our front line looks a lot better that we have this extra unit here to tank up some of the damage. Additionally, very high cap versions of this board also play around playing more more deep into the trait of Black Rose to beef up the Scion even more to help your front line, and also playing around Mordekaiser. Mordekaiser, especially if you have a Sork emblem to help fit this in, is very strong a lot of times. Black Rose emblems are also very strong, but typically a lot of times with this comp, a lot of times with this comp, you really want to have a Sork emblem just so you have the room to fit in some of the extra units here to actually like capitalize on the fact that like how do I phrase it? You want to have some extra space for the units because it's very hard to fit in enough front line as well as enough explosive backline. And it's often a lot better. You'll see stuff like this where people play 6 Sork, 5 Black Rose if they have either of the emblems because you can fit it in very nicely. And Mordekaiser just does absolutely monstrous amounts of damage. Additionally, because you have the Emissary option with Nami, sometimes you'll also see people play around emissaries with this because of the synergies that work out really nicely. A lot of times when you're playing around emissaries, Swain also becomes a backline unit. But if you're playing emissary Sorks, it looks something like this as well. This is another option, and Mbessa got buffed a lot, so this is one of the more high roll options. It is very expensive and it requires you to hit a lot of 4 costs. So as much as Sorks is like very difficult to play already, this is an even harder version to play. But basically you're still playing around the Sorks and and instead of playing deeper into the Sork trait, you can play 4 Sork Emissary, and then if you have an what's it called, if you have a Sork emblem, then you can also play 6 Sork 4 Emissary, and this is one of the highest cap version of this board. If you ever look at stats on Emissary, it's usually playing some sort of sorcerer line that looks similar to this. So you have many different options with sorcerers. Now, one other thing that changed this patch, which I'm going to talk about in a second, is rebels. So obviously I'm doing like a little bit of a tutorial kind of here, so it is taking a little bit of time on the Sork board, but I would like to just explain everything that's going on in this patch as well as some of your options when you're playing. Rebel got a buff that it gives you a little bit more HP now, so it's not like it's not that big of a buff, I don't think. So I don't think it's like makes Rebels like broken that you play it every single game. However, if you're still playing around Zoe and you're playing around Alawi, you can actually fit in Rebels pretty nicely into multiple different Sork boards. If you hit a Jinx early, often you can just play around 7 Rebel. With the buff, it's a little bit more stable, so it gives you a little bit more option. But this is a play from ahead kind of high roll situation where you find the Jinx. Typically, if you have Jinx or if you have an emblem, you can typically do something like this where you put the emblem. So let me just rearrange the items a little bit. Where you can put the Rebel emblem either on a LeBlanc or even on an Echo. And then with the Echo, basically, like you can drop an extra Rebel unit. You play 7 Rebel. You get the Ambusher trait in for the Echo. And then you can also cap out your board high around like a Rumble or other Sentinel or Scrap units as well. That kind of fits this board very nicely. But typically with this Rebel board, it's a little bit more stable now, so you can play around it a little bit more easily. But it is reliant on Alawi. Additionally, you can also just play around Sorks with the Rebel unit. So a lot of times you can just play these 2 Sentinels to help beef up your front line. And then you can still play your typical Sork line around the Rebel. Because of the extra HP to the Rebels, this Alawi becomes a lot more stable as a frontline unit. This is another option, especially if you're contested. When you're on your roll down, Elise is very hard to find a lot of the times. It's a little bit more stable now to play around having the extra Alawi, and then you can always shove in an Elise later, of course, right? You can also even play like a set instead of this for Bruiser, but you have some opportunities to now tech in or just put in some Rebel, which buffs your Zoe in terms of giving her some extra attack speed and some extra stats. But in addition, the Alawi with a little bit more HP can help make your front line a little bit more stable, and then your comp is like less burst damage heavy and a little bit more like front to back. Strong front line, strong back line type of synergy. So this is another option that you don't have to play deep into Rebel, but you can play just like 3 Rebel with the Alawi. In case you don't do this, it's quite strong, I would say, if you're playing around Sorks as an option, as an out. So lastly, the last comp that I think is very strong, got a small buff, but Enforcers is still one of the best comps to play around. Enforcer, you really have to only play from when you're really ahead. It's very dependent, I would say it's very dependent on Caitlyn. I feel like with this Sork line, you need to high roll, you need to roll deep to find a Vi 2 to stabilize, but then you also need to have a Caitlyn in order to like properly cap out your damage. Of course, if you hit 8 Enforcer, it's extremely strong, but that requires an emblem and the Caitlyn. But let's just say you're playing around 6 Enforcer, a lot of times you'll drop something like Camille, and then you'll play something along the lines of Mbessa, and some other unit, either a pit fighter to synergize for this Vi, or you'll be playing some sort of frontline trait, either a bruiser or a sentinel, to stabilize yourself on level 8. Of course, if you don't have a Caitlyn, you're just playing the other enforcer unit, the Camille, to synergize your enforcer. But you do have some options. I'll just put Camille in for now, right? Let's say you're playing around this. You can also play around, like, you know, Elise or Alawi. Basically anything that's synergized to help out your front line a little bit, but often you'll just see yourself playing something like, I don't know, like, I'll just throw in a Gangplank for fun here, Pit Fighter to help out this Vi. Typically Vi, you want sustain, so you want her to do a lot of damage, but you also want her to, like, live. You want survivability. So a lot of times, like, Asterix is a really good item on her. Additionally, you could build her with, like, Edge of Night for survivability, or even a QSS. But a lot of times you'll just see, like, stuff like Sterix and Titans as being some of her go-to build items. I personally really like Protector's Vow on her, but that's like a me thing. I'm not sure exactly how good it is, but I find that I have a lot of success whenever I build Protector's Vow with this line. But a lot of times you're just going to build frontline melee items and play around this Vi, and eventually you try and play around your Caitlyn later in the game. This board caps very high. A lot of times you're trying to make it to level 9 because you're trying to play around like 5 cost. It's that can slot in very easily, right? So you can easily play like a Savika and a Rumble, get a lot of synergies. This board is very explosive in its damage, so you need this Vi to live as well as tank. So unless you have a Vi 2, a lot of times it's very difficult for you to level to 9 and fast 9 and play around it. It's a very temperamental comp. If your lobby isn't punishing you and you have good tempo, like you're very ahead in terms of gold and HP, then this comp is very strong and you should often consider leaning towards it, especially if you have AD items and not playing around AP. But it's just very awkward a lot of the times because, you know, if you have like a Vi 1, for example, and then you're stuck without a Caitlyn, you lack so much damage, and this Vi dies so easily because she's basically majority of your damage as well as a frontline unit. So it's very temperamental, so I would always be very cautious about it. Of course, if you have an Enforcer emblem, you can put on anybody, but a lot of times it's on Mbessa, and then you can play 8 Enforcer. Caitlyn really likes to cast, so just giving her mana, and then with all of her damage amp, a lot of times just pairing her with crit items is pretty strong. So something like this. Of course, until you have a Caitlyn, your mana or AP items can go on to TF, and then your other items can go on to Vi. A lot of times you can build Vi with a lot of damage. And like I said, I usually like to put Protector's Vow on her. I don't know how broken this is. I wouldn't recommend doing this as a first pick, but a lot of times I'm left over with components. Protector's Vow helps her to cast a little bit earlier, and a lot of her damage is in her cast, where she just does the whole slam and stun and everything. So I like to have her cast earlier because it's synergized with Enforcer, that I kill a wanted unit with an early cast. I get the Enforcer chain going, and then my team kind of starts to like steamroll, basically, right? As soon as you kill a wanted unit, you gain the attack speed, and then it just goes off nuts. So like a lot of times you'll see me build something like this. I've had this build a lot, and I've had a lot of success with it. And then late game, I just move the IE onto Caitlyn, and I rearrange my Vi items depending on if I hit a Caitlyn 2 to carry. But a lot of times, this is like a good balance of a massive amount of damage and a good amount of survivability. And you get the early cast off, you get an ult, you get Enforcer proc, your whole board pops off. Like, the fight lasts like 2 seconds. It's very, very aggressive. So, these are the non-rerolls that I think are 3 of the better ones that you can try and play towards. Of course, it always depends on your spot. Scrap is really good if you're losing or if you don't know what you're doing, and you have good component augments for it. Sorcerer is really good. All the different variations. If you're playing around AP, you pretty much have to try and find one of the variations that you can make work. Either rerolling Nami Swain, playing around Zoe with either Rebel or Emissary, or like just Black Rose, and then eventually making it to a LeBlanc, and hopefully if you're not too contested, you can make it there. And then Enforcer, if you have AD items and you have a lot of tempo and you're really streaking or really powerful early, this can work out as well. Now, let's talk about reroll comps. Visionary reroll, like Renata reroll, hasn't really changed all that much. Renata reroll, typically you're just trying to play as many Sentinels and Visionaries as possible. I do believe that more, how do I phrase it? I believe that in general, you usually try and play around 6 Visionary with this line. I'm just going to drop somebody. I'm trying to figure out who to drop. Let's just remove this guy for now. So a lot of times what you end up playing is something like this, where you're playing around Sentinels with Visionary units. Obviously, this is way too many units to fit on a board of TFT. So if you don't have a spat, you have to pick either one of Sentinel or Visionary to be your main trait that you're playing. A lot of times you're playing 6 Visionary. That's like the higher cap version. So you end up with a board that looks something like this, right? Where you're playing, you know, eventually, right? Until you get to this point, usually you're playing either 6 Visionary, 2 Sentinel, you're playing 4 Visionary, 4 Sentinel. But this is a reroll line where you're rerolling around Renata. A lot of times you see people, they'll clump their units around the Renata. It's because of her ability. Whenever she attacks an opponent, a unit, she makes it so that when her bullets pass through her own allies, they gain a shield. Because of that, you want her to scale up her AP really aggressively, so one of the most important items on her is an Archangel's. And then typically you want her to cast as much as possible, so a Shojin Nashor's is something that works out well, and is a good use of components to kind of like make this work out. So when you're playing around Renata, you just want her to stall as long as possible by continuing to cast and saving these people from dying by giving them a huge amount of health shield. So a lot of times you're going to clump around the Renata. Depending on what you hit, you can roll on level 5 to try and hit Singe 3, Irelia 3, or you can try and roll on level 6 to go for an easier time finding Renata 3-star and Rel 3-star, which is typically what I recommend. 6 Visionary has this huge spike. It did get nerfed very slightly, but I still think this comp is very strong for what I've been seeing today. So I don't think it got all that changed. But basically, you heal a little bit with 6 Visionary, and it also helps you to cast a lot because you basically gain a bunch of mana. So the healing aspect allows you with 6 Visionary to have a lot more tankiness, often more than having like 6 Sentinel in a lot of the time. So you usually want to play around 6 Visionary, and then this is the type of comp that works really well with Starry Night and different reroll augments because you can just 3-star everybody. The more 3-stars, the better. Typically, I would hope to have at least 2 3-star frontline units and Renata 3, but you can play around Vex, you can play around Morgana. Morgana is great at spreading damage, so something like, both of them, Vex and Morgana, both have like AoE really good damage dealing, so like putting anti-heal on them is very strong, either in the form of Red Buff or Morello. But typically you can itemize them as an additional carry, and then eventually you can cap out your board around a Malzahar, or you can even play some 6 cost because the comp has a little bit of flexibility in what units you play. With the Rebel buff as well, it also helps to have a Lowy, and it makes Irelia 3 a little bit more of a demon because she gets a little bit of HP in addition to all the armor from Sentinel. Now, Artillerist. Urgot got nerfed a lot, but it doesn't seem that substantial because I think it's still a really strong comp. There's many different ways to play Artillerist reroll, but typically you're trying to go for Tristana 3 and Urgot 3. When you're playing around Urgot, you want frontline melee items, so a lot of times it's like Bloodthirster, Sterix, and Titans. These are the type of items that you're looking for because you want to kind of drain tank and cast his ult as many times as possible because it's very strong. When you're playing around Tristana, however, she's a scaling unit that gains AD over time, so it depends on what point of the game it is, but a lot of times you'll see like Tristana with the Gwynsu, and then you'll see them build like IE type IE and crit glove items, so something like a Last Whisper if you're early game to get you the efficiency of Sundering. But a lot of times you'll see something like this, you get some damage amp and some crit chance with Guard Breaker, your ult can crit with IE, and that's really important because if you look at her ability, she gains over time permanently 1% attack damage every time she kills with her ult. So you want her ult to be this explosive shot. She's going to scale up and gain more and more attack damage over time. So if you can just pair that with either a bunch of damage amp, which you can get from something like Guard Breaker, or if you pair it with like 100% or a high crit chance, which is something like IE, which makes the ult crit as well, then you can basically get a guaranteed kill or a more guaranteed kill. It kind of ups her damage by a lot. And then Gwynsu just helps her to cast a bunch, so it's really effective early game. Late game, the Gwynsu doesn't stack as high often because you're either just one-shotting everything or you're losing the fight. So Tristana's a little bit harder to play around. You really want to have an early Tristana in order to get as many stacks as possible. But you can often lose the Gwynsu and just put a generic attack speed item. Something like, you know, that gives a bunch of attack speed like a Red Buff or a Giant Slayer. Often is really good late game because of how much damage she does. What's it called? Gunblade is also really good, but typically just for efficiency, Gwynsu is good for like most stages of the game until like the very end. So a lot of times just stick with the Gwynsu and you're fine. And this works out really nicely. Now with this board, there's many different variations. A lot of times you're capping around 4 artillerists. So I have the Corki and the Ezreal. But when you're trying to play the board, you can basically play around Sentinels if it's uncontested. This is one variation. This variation is more playing around Tristana. Basically, this is like you're trying to make a very strong front line and you're prioritizing Tristana items. So you might not even itemize or even go for Urgot 3 in these type of situations. And instead, you're going for like your 3-star front lines. But these are more towards Tristana, right? You can also play it with Bruisers a lot of the time. where you're just like trying to upgrade and play as many bruisers as possible. And here, like, you know, you're going for like set 3 and you're trying to play around these units. The board that is typically the strongest variation of this is when you're playing more towards Urgot with experiment and synergies that help out with the Urgot. So a lot of times it will look something like this, the board, if you're looking for something to throw into a team planner. It's typically like this. So what you do is you pair Urgot with Zyra for the experiment bonus because it works out really nicely. Zyra gives him true damage, and then he also has like the health shield that applies every time he casts his ult, which gives him a huge amount of survivability and a huge amount of damage with the extra attack speed and the true damage from Zyra. You want to have Pit Fighter in because you're basically just trying to play into all of the synergies of Urgot. So this gives you Pit Fighter, gives you Bruiser, which gives you a little bit of tankiness. And then you get the Form Swapper and Scrap eventually for Corki. So this is typically the board that you go for, something like this. Tristana can still scale over time, but typically when you're playing this board, because Urgot's your main carry, Tristana kind of gets kill stolen a lot of the time, so she doesn't stack as much. So Tristana isn't even that reliable, and often you don't even care too much about Tristana 3 here. But you kind of have to analyze and look. The board's very flexible, right? If you're deciding to play around Artilleryst, I just showed you like 3 different variations. If you're playing more towards Tristana, this board's not as much frontline, so it really relies on Urgot 3 being like the 1v9 unit, right? He's going to tank and do everything. A lot of times, this is the variation that you play when you see something like Unleash the Beast. Unleash the Beast, you just try and stack as many Sterix on this unit as possible and you just watch them pop off. But Unleash the Beast is still like a win condition, like you see it, and you can just force towards Urgot, and a lot of times it's a top 4, and that's just how this works as well. There's also other Artillerist things like Rocket Collection that can work well with these type of lines. But, you know, if you're playing around Urgot, this is the variation. If you're playing around Tristana, the other 2 are a little bit reliable or a little bit more reliable often. Finally, last comp to talk about in this video, Zeri reroll. Zeri reroll is very strong. I would say I wouldn't really play around Zeri without a couple conditions. So first of all, items on Zeri. Zeri really wants to have Guinsoo, Gunblade, and then the last item is debatable. I've seen top level players that are absolutely demons and way better than I'll ever be in my entire life saying that you should play double Guinsoo because the Zeri really wants attack speed. I've seen people that are equally as good that say that they'd rather have a damage item than they say IE, but just know a lot of times what you want is Guinsoo, Gunblade, and then you're either going for a damage item or more attack speed. This comp is really broken. It's the reason that it's really broken in certain situations. I would say it's really good if other people are rerolling. A lot of times people are playing or contesting Renata, and a lot of times people are playing or contesting around Urgot. So a lot of times you can hit for free if you play around Zeri, which is where you usually want to play. You want to play when other people are rerolling. You don't want to just play it out of nowhere if you don't have a good spot for it, because it often is just not worth it. It falls off kind of awkwardly at certain points in the game. It has a really high cap. It has a really high like early game, but like in the mid game it's very dodgy, especially if you don't have your complete upgrades. But typically just make sure that you're prioritizing Guinsoo and Gunblade on the Zeri. Now there's many different variations to play around this. A lot of times you're just gonna have one other sniper with your board, and you're gonna play Sentinels. Actually, Sentinel Zeri is I think like people call it the Sentinel board. You know, people try and come up with these cute names for the TFT comps to make it more enjoyable and likable by the general community. But typically the attack speed bonus you get from Singe is really important. So a lot of times you're playing Singed on this 6 Sentinel board, and 6 Sentinel is just a really reliable front line that gives you a lot of tankiness. So a lot of times this is the higher cap version of the Zeri board, is that you just try and play around 6 Sentinel. You go for like Rel 3-star, Zeri 3-star, and maybe sometimes Leona 3, but often you just you try and pick up some of the 1 costs as well. So it works really well with Starry Night as well. This is one variation, and I think this is the stronger one. But a lot of times, people are contesting Sentinels, right? A lot of times you're playing Zeri, somebody's playing Renata, so they're buying all the Sentinels. Somebody's doing this, and they're buying all the other units. So a lot of times you can play this version, which is just with Watchers. Watchers, you get to play around Firelight, which is pretty nice, because it helps out Zeri. It's not super important, but here you're typically going for Vander 3, and if you can, Vlad 3. And you just play around 6 Watcher with a Bruiser in the back line. You can also go for Kog'Maw instead of Twitch in these setups, but a lot of times it's beneficial to play Twitch because he has a good ability to apply his effects long range, right? Like he attacks and shoots through units, so he has a good he's very good, he's very good at applying a Last Whisper to multiple units. But Zeri is all about attack speed, because the way that she works, she doesn't have mana that generates for her, so you want her to proc her passive as many times as possible, so you want her to get to 3 attacks, hit damage, 3 attacks, hit damage, 3 attacks, hit damage. So a lot of times, it's very effective to just put her with a bunch of attack speed. Now, these type of builds, especially if you have like a really stable front line, sometimes you can just go double Guinsoo and a damage item, but typically this is your go-to. There are many different variations. You start with Guinsoo, you see it, you try and make Gunblade, and then if you can't make Gunblade, you better hope that you have enough front line in order to stall and ramp up the Zeri to a point where she's absolutely melting everybody. But you know, a typical build that you'll see is something like this. Gunblade, Guinsoo, IE, and then you just put the other utility items on the Twitch. That helps to spread them out pretty well. Anyways, those are all the boards that I want to show you today. As per the previous video, I'm pretty sure they're the exact same boards, or very similar to the boards I showed last time. Of course, the patch wasn't that big. This is mostly for like beginner players, or maybe like a little check-in, just to see like, hey, like, you know, maybe you forgot something, or you wanted to just like get a little refresher. Hopefully it was enjoyable. Tomorrow, I think I said I was going to do it today to somebody in the comments. I'm sorry to the commenter. I'm going to do tomorrow all the hero augments. So that's going to include all the double up augments. So like, not double up, all the ones where it's like, you know, reunion, gain a vine, gain a jinx, you know, like all of those ones. So I'm going to do all of, or sorry, gain a Vi, gain an Echo, and blah, 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 blah. I'm going to go through all of those ones with a board that's approximately like what you should be aiming for. And I'm also going to go through the more like, what do I call it? The more like traditional hero augments, where it's like, you know, gain a Trundle, he goes nuts, you know, gain an Irelia, she goes crazy. I'm going to go through all those boards tomorrow. I kind of was going to try and do them one by one as I got them. You know, I have an Irelia video and a Vladimir video on my channel, but somebody asked me for them because I guess I'm just not fast enough in high rolling myself into those spots to play those augments. So a lot of them got changed in the recent patch. A lot of them got buffed or reworked or changed, right? I think the prismatic one, where it's Heimer and Echo Geniuses, is like the most broken augment in the game right now. So we're going to talk about all of those tomorrow. So make sure to like and subscribe if you want to see those. And if you've been waiting for them, they're coming tomorrow. Thanks for watching, and see ya. Bye-bye.